Robert Irwin is one of the artists I most admire. I've taught a class called Visual Thinking for 25 years, and he's always the first video I show. It's a film called The Beauty of Questions, and he's truly led a life full of questions and explorations and never getting stuck in a rut. Even when he was a famous painter in Venice Beach, he shocked people by concluding that he was done with painting, hunting for a new form of artwork, and walked away from the whole idea of having a big studio that he needed to make paintings in. Before we talk more about Irwin, I'd like to think more generally about our current images of art. And one way to do that is a short visualization. So in the next slide, I'm going to read something and ask you to close your eyes and imagine seeing an artist at work. And it could be any sort of artist. So just in the next slide, take 90 seconds, follow the suggestions I have, and see what kind of picture of an artist emerges. Close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, relax, and begin to imagine an artist at work. This could be a famous artist, or a friend or relative who is a painter, or a more generalized archetype of a sculptor, a painter, etc. As you begin to imagine someone, focus on their hand. They are making something with a tool. Is it a paintbrush? Is it a sculptor with a chisel, a person with a pencil, or someone drawing on a tablet? It might be a ceramic artist throwing clay on a wheel, a metal artist welding steel, or an illustrator using a computer or phone to make a digital painting. Zoom out from the artist's hand. What is the appearance of this artist? Age, gender, ethnicity. How are they dressed? It could be a painter wearing a smock or someone in faded overalls with paint daubs on them, or dressed in any other way. Gaze at their face and notice how they are moving their body while they make their work. What is their inner state? Do they seem calm, energized, euphoric, or maybe even a bit melancholy? What are they making? Imagine the colors of the painting or the forms they are sculpting. What sort of space are they working in? It could be a classic Parisian garret, a vast warehouse filled with tools and materials, a clean and organized office, or maybe they are working outdoors, creating an image of the sea or a field of flowers. Finally, what sounds might you expect to hear in this space? What scents or smells? For instance, with oil paint, there's almost always a pungent scent of turpentine. Now you can open your eyes and move on to the next slide. In just a few sentences, describe something of what you saw when you closed your eyes, imagining an artist at work. It might have been highly visual, a clear image, or it might have just been thoughts about, well, I'm kind of imagining someone like Monet. Just as an example, this film was one of my first images of what it meant possibly to be an artist, having come not from a family of artists. Charlton Heston was an action hero star, and I watched this film a few years ago, and I thought it still stood up. If you think about it related to first images of artists, there's a lot of passion and confrontation between the artist and this particular vision of Michelangelo, and battling with the Pope over when will this ceiling be finished. So, from the clip in the previous slide, imagine you're a child, you're taken to this movie, the agony and the ecstasy, and something about it appeals to you. What would you know about artists at that point? I think a lot of the image of an artist would be that they're passionate, temperamental, somewhat egotistical, combative, very opinionated. I think there are parallels between Van Gogh and Michelangelo in terms of the dramatic, romantic, passionate image that was painted by novels and movies about the artists. Here we have another action hero, Kirk Douglas, probably near the end of Van Gogh's life, painting in a cornfield with ominous black crows flying over him. There's another clip on YouTube that might be interesting to compare these two. And also, these were my first messages of what it meant to be an artist. What were yours? So we've all grown up with tubes of paint being things we could buy at the store. And I always loved that when I started painting. I was about 12, other than, kids' projects in school. Uh, but this was a new technology it was actually invented by a portrait painter named John Gough Rand in 1841. And there's definitely ways that this inventive new way of storing paint and transporting it helped people to paint out in the open, out in the field, which was such a key thing for the Impressionist artist. And also, just a little mention here, this is the first Impressionist painting. And there's a museum in Paris that took me years to find called the Musée Marmottan. And when you step off the elevator to the lower level where the largest collection of Monets in the world is stored, you see this painting, which is quite small and a little pale. And it was called L'Impression. And later that term was used by early critics to deride the movement in painting. In the clip of the film Lust for Life about Van Gogh, what parallels and what differences are there between the portrayal of the work of Michelangelo and what his life was like? And also, not just from a 3-minute clip, consider anything you happen to know about these two very famous artists. And this is a shot, a pretty famous one, of 7 artists who rose to prominence, who all happened to be working, at least for a time, in the Venice Beach area. Many of them still live there, own property there, and this is Robert Irwin here, and a young Robert Irwin, and he was part of this scene. And one thing that brought these 7 artists together was many of them were surfers, but a more significant thing is they were, for the most part, members of a gallery in LA in the 60s called Ferris Gallery, and that became important to their careers. I hope you'll consider watching the entire Robert Irwin film. I've actually watched it 70 times probably while teaching my students. I think it opens up the boundary of art, which is certainly one of my main interests. And it's been a long time since it's been available publicly, but there's the link, or you can search on YouTube for Robert Irwin, The Beauty of Questions, a film by Leonard Feinstein. It just tells so much about Southern California art history from the 60s onward. And Irwin is still practicing art all over the world in his 80s. I won't say much about this painting of it's a Robert Irwin painting from the 70s. So most of these paintings are large, 4 feet square to even 6 feet square. And he's coming out of like 2 decades before the thing that was happening in painting was abstract expressionism, and he's still shaped by that, but he's also trying to kind of get out of that box. So you'll see in work that occurred after this, his painting becomes much more minimal, much more elemental. And I think this quote kind of puts to rest the notion that artists are lazy or have this super relaxed life. Speaking from experience, I've known people that were envious, imagining there's all this free time and things just magically happen. Life is good because you're talented. But I think the artists that impress me are very disciplined. And this painting of Irwin, again, obsessive and amazing amounts of time arranging 3 or 4 lines on a large colored surface. He'd say at points he would just nod off. He'd sit in front of these paintings all day, trying to see what the most perfect small change that could be made to make them more perfect. I'm no art historian, but I certainly see this transition and connection between these two works. Uh, I see pattern, I see linearity. The piece on the right actually has the color, it's not just a black and white image. And there's this consistency. You see these Irwins, once you know what his work looks like in different decades, this is made from fluorescent tubes, the piece on the right. And if you've ever been, Cedars-Sinai is one of the biggest hospitals in Los Angeles across from the Beverly Center. And if you drive past it, you'll see something like this. And it's an art installation that was commissioned for the hospital. And it's be easy to just think, why the heck is there a wall with funny arrangements of fluorescent lights? So many of the artists of the 70s, particularly in Southern California, were interested in phenomenology. Part of that is to have a direct, essential experience of a natural moment or natural happening and to be present. So there's even maybe an overlap with an interest that many of these artists, at least in LA, had in Zen Buddhism. I can't speak for other artists, but certainly there's a tradition, particularly for visual artists and probably composers, to be working in a degree of separation, isolation. I guess solitude is the word for when it's a good thing. And I just don't think I can recall too many people I've met that were devoted to their art, that it's things you really can't do with other people around. And indeed, Irwin had this period where he didn't wander the desert continuously. He stayed in a cabin or something, but he spent a lot of time out in the desert, which many people find spiritual, reading these philosophers that he had never read before and just trying to go deeper with the meaning of making art. So sometimes artists have studio envy, and this is Market Street in Venice Beach, and I'm sure it looks rather different now. Irwin leased a big storefront, and that was his painting studio for years. And no doubt some people thought, wow, you're lucky you found this space. But then as he began to feel like he had finished what he had to do with painting, he moved on, and people said, what are you going to do with your own studio? And as soon as he realized he didn't need it, he got rid of it. I will admit that before I read more about Irwin, there's one of these disc pieces in many of the best contemporary museums that I've been to. And I would kind of walk by it, kind of going, oh, that's nice. It's visually quiet. I don't really get it. So my interest grew as I learned more about him and what was behind the creation of this. I like this because it shows the actual form of the piece. And this is actually a domed piece of metal that he has shaped by people that usually build custom cars. And then he was very careful. What he was trying to do was avoid the edge, the border of a rectangular painting. And then he lights it in a way with four lights very carefully placed to try and make it hover off the wall. This is one of my favorite Irwin pieces, and I just have a couple more slides. It's hard; you really have to be there. And again, it's an art installation. So this is the La Jolla Museum of Contemporary Art. Now it's part of the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, located in La Jolla. So actually, really beautiful setting. And this is tinted glass, and there's what we call a mitered glass corner. And why is this lighter? He actually cuts out the glass, so the artwork is puncturing the tinted glass to review an uninterrupted view of the sea. So there's no glass here. It's just a puncture, a very clean cut through the mitered glass in this room that has an incredible panoramic view of the ocean. If you have been to the Getty Center in Los Angeles, you have walked through a Robert Irwin piece if you went down into the garden. I love this plan shot, which I've never seen before. There's a path you meander down, and there's quotations. You have to sort of, you can bring your own interpretation to it, of course. And there's this very geometric garden. Um, what this entire space would have been if the architect of the Getty Center, Richard Meyer, who's kind of a minimalist, in my opinion, kind of regimented architect, instead of this sinuous garden, there was a plan that he had, which was to basically put in a grid of columns, like so to impose a very like rectilinear structure. So I'm happy the people running the Getty chose to involve Irwin in the garden. I think this piece shows the breadth of his practice in art, and it's I love the title because it shows his humor. Who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue? So this does not look anything like the disc paintings or the paintings from the 70s. That's because he's always changing. He's always trying to find the next thing that interests him that he thinks is important. And he's also had an art career of more than 6 decades at this point. So Robert Irwin did not set out to create a type of art called light and space art, but he was certainly one of the most important artists that allowed critics to possibly cook up this title. It's some of my favorite type of artwork. James Turrell would be another example. And it's in case of Turrell, it's you're not looking at a painting of the sky, you're gazing at the actual sky and he makes the color change. So just remarkable. I love sort of seeing the cross pollination in the art world and sometimes the art world and the science world. Um, so this little mind map, I just put Robert Irwin here, and he was the teacher of my mentor, a very noted collage artist named Alexis Smith. He was the teacher of Chris Burden, who in the 70s was famous for outrageous, dangerous performance artworks, and then later creates one of the iconic artworks of public art in LA, which is called Urban Light in front of the LA County Museum of Art. This is Ed Wertz and Irwin, and he and this artist did experiments at Caltech using some of their scientific apparatus, and Edwards figured out how space suits and moonwalks were going to work. And we'll be learning more about James Turrell, who has been transforming this crater in Arizona for 29 years into a sky observation center, which is on the scale of the Maya. Also, I just learned a couple weeks ago that there's going to be a major retrospective of my mentor Alexis Smith's work in San Diego at the Contemporary Museum in La Jolla. Should be a great show. Can't wait to see that. And the last slide, I think I talked about this briefly. And if you've watched the Irwin film, this is in the early portion of the film. This is Robert Irwin in probably his 40s. This is a young artist who had gotten out of graduate school at Pomona College. His name is James Turrell. And then here they are sitting with Ed Wertz, who at the time they met, they were introduced by a program trying to cross pollinate between art and technology. Ed Wertz at that time had no interest in art, but over many hours of discussion, he he realized that there was a lot of similarity with the explorations of someone like Irwin. And in this anechoic chamber, which is a totally sound dampened space with no outside sound and a Faraday cage, there's no electromagnetic. Each of these three individuals agreed to sit in a chair for a couple hours and see what effect it had to be that sensory deprived. So, once again, consider giving an hour to watch this film. I find it remarkable, and the many, many times I've watched it, I haven't ever been bored. He's just such an intriguing individual, and also I was lucky enough to spend a lot of my 20s working for famous artists, not Irwin, but friends of his in the Venice art scene, and it was just a remarkable education. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation about Robert Irwin.